At the divorce hearing, my husband smirked. "You'll never see another penny of my money." Then the judge opened one envelope. The day my marriage officially ended, my husband walked into the courthouse looking like he'd already won. His expensive Italian suit looked freshly tailored. His smile never faded. Every person he greeted received the same confident handshake, the kind that belonged to someone who believed the future was already signed in his favor. Beside him stood his new girlfriend. She looked at least 10 years younger than me, wore designer sunglasses indoors, and carried herself as though she were attending a charity gala instead of someone else's divorce hearing. She wasn't nervous. Neither was he. They were celebrating. When they spotted me entering the courtroom, he leaned toward her and whispered something that made them both laugh. 6 months earlier, that laugh would have shattered me. That morning, I barely reacted. Because grief has an expiration date. Humiliation does too. Eventually, all that's left is clarity. My name is Emily Carter, and I was 43 years old when I finally understood that the most dangerous people aren't always liars. Sometimes they're people who become convinced they'll never face consequences. If you've ever watched someone mistake arrogance for intelligence, then you'll understand exactly how this story ends. But before I tell you why the judge laughed in the middle of our divorce hearing, you need to know how we got there. 20 years earlier, nothing about our lives looked impressive. I was 23 years old, working 12-hour shifts as an emergency room nurse in Columbus, Ohio. My husband, back then just Ryan Carter, owned exactly one pickup truck, 2 rusted ladders, and more ambition than common sense. He had started a small remodeling business with a friend from high school. Most months they barely made enough money to pay themselves. Some weeks they didn't. Our first apartment was so small that if one of us opened the refrigerator door, the other had to move out of the kitchen. The air conditioner worked only when it felt generous. During winter, we covered the windows with blankets because cold air slipped through every crack. We weren't unhappy. We were exhausted. But we were building something together. Or at least, I believed we were. Ryan worked every weekend. I picked up extra hospital shifts whenever someone called in sick. There were months when we ate spaghetti, 4 nights in a row because it was all we could afford. Sometimes we'd sit on the apartment floor with paper plates because we couldn't afford a proper dining table. Ryan used to smile and say, "One day we'll laugh about this." And we did. Back then, everything felt temporary. The struggles, the debt, the uncertainty, even our old pickup truck that needed a prayer before every ignition. Then things started changing. Slowly at first. Ryan landed a large commercial renovation contract. Then another. Within 5 years, he'd hired 20 employees. Within 8, more than 80. The tiny company we'd built together had become one of the fastest growing construction firms in central Ohio. People started recognizing him. Local newspapers interviewed him. Business magazines called him a self-made entrepreneur. Every award he received ended up displayed in his office. He loved that office. Glass walls, imported furniture, a giant walnut desk. He once joked that it cost more than our first house. I wasn't sure he was joking. People often ask whether success changes someone. I don't think it does. I think success removes whatever mask they were already wearing. Ryan didn't become arrogant overnight. He evolved, like rust spreading beneath fresh paint. At first, it was little things. He stopped asking about my day. Stopped waiting for me before eating dinner. Stopped saying thank you. He'd interrupt me during conversations. Correct my stories in front of other people. Finish my sentences. Sometimes he'd introduce me at company dinners by saying, "This is Emily." Not, "This is my wife." Not, "The woman who helped me build this." Just, "Emily." Eventually he stopped inviting me to company events altogether. "They're mostly networking," he'd explain. "You'd probably be bored." I believed him. Because that's what people in love do. They explain away behavior that should concern them. I stayed at the hospital. Everyone assumed I'd eventually quit working. Ryan certainly expected it. But nursing wasn't just my job. It was part of who I was. I liked helping frightened people. I liked solving problems. I liked going home knowing someone had experienced one less terrible day because I'd been there. Ryan used to admire that. Then he began looking down on it. One evening we attended a fundraiser for local business owners. Someone asked what I did. "I'm a trauma nurse." Before the woman could respond, Ryan laughed. "My wife could run a hospital if she wanted." I smiled. That sounded supportive. Then he added, "But she's too sentimental to think like a business person." Everyone laughed politely, including me. On the drive home, I stared through the passenger window. Ryan never noticed how quiet I'd become. The first time I suspected there might be another woman wasn't because of perfume, or lipstick, or mysterious phone calls. It was something much simpler. Ryan became protective of his schedule. For 20 years, I had always known where he was. Not because I monitored him, because married people naturally share their lives. Suddenly, everything became vague. Late meetings, unexpected conferences, client dinners, weekend inspections. He never gave specific addresses anymore, just general explanations. Construction, business, networking, growth. Every answer sounded reasonable, almost too reasonable. One Friday evening, I asked where he was traveling Monday morning. He answered immediately, Nashville. 2 minutes later, he corrected himself. I meant Louisville. Then he laughed. Too many cities. Maybe people forget details when they're inventing them. The credit card statements changed too. Luxury hotels, 5-star restaurants, boutiques I'd never visited. At first, I assumed they were business expenses. Ryan made good money. Clients expected expensive dinners. Then one charge caught my attention. A spa resort, almost $1,200. I waited until after dinner. What's this? He barely glanced at the statement. Corporate retreat. I looked again. For one person? He shrugged. They upgraded me. The conversation ended there. At least, he thought it had. 3 weeks later, I finished an unusually difficult shift. A teenager had died after a car accident. Nobody on our team spoke much afterward. Those are the days nurses carry home with them. Instead of taking the interstate, I drove through downtown hoping traffic would be lighter. That's when I saw Ryan's black SUV parked outside one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. At first I smiled. Maybe I'd surprise him. Maybe we could have dessert together. Then I looked through the front window. He wasn't alone. Across from him sat a beautiful brunette, early 30s. Elegant, confident. She reached across the table. He took her hand without hesitation. Not awkwardly, not cautiously, comfortably, like people who'd done it dozens of times before. He looked at her the way he'd stopped looking at me years earlier. I stood there for maybe 20 seconds, long enough to understand everything, short enough that they never noticed me. Then I turned around, walked back to my car, closed the door, and finally let myself cry. Not because he'd betrayed me, because in that moment, I realized I'd been mourning this marriage long before I knew it was dead. I just hadn't admitted it yet. I drove home. Ryan arrived almost 3 hours later carrying takeout containers. Sorry, he smiled. Client dinner ran late. I looked at him for several seconds. He smiled so naturally, so effortlessly. The lie came easier to him than the truth ever had. That night I lay awake beside a man I no longer recognized. And for the first time in 20 years, I stopped wondering how to save my marriage. Instead, I started wondering what else he was hiding. Daniel looked at me as if he were trying to calculate exactly how much I knew. For 19 years, I had recognized every expression on his face. I knew when he was confident, when he was lying, when he was pretending not to care. But this expression was different. Fear, not fear of losing me. Fear of losing control. He waited for an answer. How much do you know? I held his gaze. Enough to stop believing anything you say. For a second, I thought he might argue. Instead, he lowered his eyes. That silence told me more than any confession ever could. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded near the entrance. Someone shouted Daniel's name. He didn't answer. Vanessa hurried toward a black SUV without looking at anyone. Cameras followed her as she disappeared inside. Karen touched my shoulder. Let's go. As we walked toward the parking garage, I finally exhaled. For months, I had lived inside survival mode. Every document, every bank statement, every sleepless night had led to this moment. But strangely, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Very tired. That evening, my apartment was unusually quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows, while I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of documents that had completely taken over my life. Tax returns, wire transfers, business filings, corporate registrations, pages and pages of numbers. 19 years of marriage had somehow become paperwork. I picked up the sealed envelope that had changed everything in court. The judge still had the original. This was my copy. 10 pages. No accusations. No emotional speeches. Just facts. Dates. Transactions. Contradictions. Sometimes the truth doesn't need dramatic language. It only needs to be organized. Around 9 o'clock, Karen called. I've got news. I immediately sat up straighter. What happened? The judge signed the order. For what? Expanded discovery. I closed my eyes. That was exactly what Daniel had been trying to prevent. Karen continued. They'll be examining every company connected to him. Every company? Every single one. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Hope. The following week became a blur. Forensic accountants requested records. Banks received subpoenas. Business partners were contacted. The investigation moved quietly, professionally, but relentlessly. Every day another request went out. Every day another document arrived. Karen warned me not to expect immediate answers. Financial investigations are like puzzles, she said. You don't solve them by looking at one piece. You solve them when enough pieces finally connect. 3 weeks later, one of those pieces arrived. Rebecca, the forensic investigator, called me directly. I think we found something. My heartbeat accelerated. What? Can you meet this afternoon? We met inside a conference room downtown. Rebecca spread dozens of papers across the table. Colored tabs marked different sections. She pointed toward one folder. Remember Stonebridge Consulting? I nodded. We finally identified who created it. I waited. It wasn't an independent company. She slid another document toward me. It was registered using an address that belongs to another business Daniel already owned. I frowned. So he was moving money between companies that he effectively controlled. Karen looked at me, which means the consulting fees may never have been real. I stared at the paperwork. So he billed himself? Rebecca nodded. Then moved the money elsewhere. Another folder appeared. Apex Development Solutions. Same story. Another shell company. Another hidden trail. Another layer. I rubbed my temples. How many are there? Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Finally, she said, So far? She looked at Karen. 5. 5 companies. 5 fake trails. 5 ways to hide money. And somehow, I still had the feeling we hadn't reached the bottom. That night I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, I walked onto my apartment balcony. Chicago was almost silent. Streetlights reflected on wet pavement. I remembered something Daniel once told me years ago when his business first became successful. The trick isn't making money, he'd said. It's keeping people from asking where it comes from. At the time, I thought he was joking. Now, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital for my shift. Halfway through lunch, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Normally, I ignored unknown numbers. Something told me not to. Hello? A woman answered. Quiet. Nervous. Is this Sarah Mitchell? Yes. My name isn't important. I frowned. Who is this? I used to work for your husband. Every instinct in my body became alert. What do you want? There was a long pause. Then she whispered, I think you deserve to know what really happened. For the next several days, I barely slept. Every evening after finishing my shift at the hospital, I sat at the tiny dining table in my apartment, surrounded by stacks of financial records, bank statements, tax filings, credit card reports, business disclosures. I highlighted dates, circled account numbers, and covered pages with sticky notes until the table disappeared beneath the paperwork. At first, everything looked random. Then the pattern slowly began to emerge. The strange transactions all started around the same time, about 9 months earlier, the same month Daniel met Vanessa. Coincidence? I didn't believe in coincidences anymore. The first transfer that caught my attention wasn't even particularly large, just under $12,000. The description simply read, consulting services, except there was no consulting contract, no invoice, no explanation, only money leaving one account and disappearing into another. Then I found another one, $23,000, another consulting payment, different company, same format, same vague description. The more I searched, the more companies appeared. Stonebridge Consulting, Apex Development Solutions, Harbor Financial Group. None of them sounded suspicious. That was exactly what made them suspicious. Karen called late one evening. I think it's time you meet someone. Who? A forensic accountant. The words made my stomach tighten. Do we really need one? If Daniel is hiding assets, absolutely. The following afternoon, I met Rebecca Cole. She was in her early 50s, calm, methodical, and somehow able to make complicated financial records seem almost simple. She spent nearly 2 hours silently reviewing everything I had collected. Finally, she looked up. Your instincts were right. I leaned forward. So he's hiding money? Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slid one statement toward me. "Look here." I frowned. "I don't see it." "Exactly." I looked again. Still nothing. She smiled. "That's the point." She picked up a pen. "When someone wants to steal money, they usually move large amounts." She circled several tiny transactions. "But when someone wants to hide money," she tapped the page, "they move it a little at a time." Suddenly I saw it. 5,000, 8,000, 12,000, 15,000. Hundreds of small transfers spread across months. Individually, nothing unusual. Together, nearly $300,000. I stared at the total. "Oh my God." Rebecca nodded. "Exactly." Over the next 2 weeks, she continued digging. Every evening, another discovery appeared. Another transfer, another hidden account, another shell company. Eventually, Rebecca looked at Karen and quietly said, "This isn't someone trying to protect money during a divorce." Karen frowned. "What is it?" "This has been happening for years." That sentence changed everything. Until then, I believed the affair had destroyed my marriage. Now I realized the affair was only one symptom. Daniel had been living a double life long before Vanessa entered the picture. A few days later, Karen called again. "This is important." "What happened?" "I found Daniel's former accountant. His name was Richard Collins. He had worked for Daniel for almost 12 years before quietly resigning. We met inside a small coffee shop outside Chicago. Richard looked exhausted before he even sat down. "I've been waiting for someone to ask questions." Those were the first words out of his mouth. "What do you mean?" I asked. He stirred his coffee slowly. "About 4 years ago, Daniel became obsessed with moving money." "Moving it where?" "That's what I wanted to know." He smiled bitterly. I never got an answer. Richard explained how invoices would suddenly disappear. Payments were split into multiple transfers. Documents were recreated. Numbers changed. Whenever he questioned anything, Daniel always had an explanation. Tax planning, temporary investments, client reimbursements. Nothing ever sounded impossible. "Just incomplete. Did you report him?" Richard looked down. I raised concerns. "And?" "They told me to stop asking questions." He paused. "So I retired." Karen looked at him carefully. "Do you believe crimes were committed?" Richard didn't answer for several seconds. "Finally, I believe someone worked very hard to make sure nobody ever looked closely." Driving home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about his words. Someone worked very hard to make sure nobody looked closely. That perfectly described Daniel. He never wanted people asking questions. He wanted admiration, trust, blind loyalty. Exactly what I had given him for 19 years. 2 mornings later, everything changed again. There was a large envelope outside my apartment door. No return address, no note, only my name written neatly across the front. Inside were dozens of photocopied bank records, wire transfers, internal emails, payment approvals. Someone inside Daniel's company had mailed them anonymously. Karen came over immediately. We spread everything across my dining table. Rebecca joined us an hour later. Halfway through the stack, she suddenly stopped. "Wait." She picked up one email, read it again, then handed it to Karen. Karen's eyebrows shot up. "What?" Rebecca pointed to a single sentence. "Move the consulting payment through Apex. Delete the original invoice afterward. Signed, Daniel Mitchell." Silence filled the apartment. Finally, Karen looked at me. "This changes everything." I swallowed. "Is it enough?" Rebecca nodded slowly. "It's enough for the judge to start asking questions." Karen smiled for the first time in weeks. "And once a judge starts asking questions..." She closed the folder. People like Daniel usually run out of answers. The next hearing was only 6 days away. Neither Daniel nor Vanessa had any idea what was waiting for them. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, fastening the last button of a navy blazer. I hadn't worn in years. No expensive jewelry, no dramatic makeup, no attempt to impress anyone. I wasn't walking into court to win sympathy. I was walking in with the truth. Karen met me outside the courthouse. She carried 2 thick binders. I carried only one sealed envelope. She noticed it immediately. "You never told me what you put in there." "You'll find out when everyone else does." She smiled. "I've learned not to underestimate you." Inside the courtroom, Daniel was already seated. He looked completely relaxed. His attorney chatted comfortably beside him. Vanessa sat in the front row wearing a cream-colored designer suit. smiling as if today's hearing were merely a formality. When Daniel noticed me, he leaned back in his chair. "I hope you're ready to move on after today." His confidence almost made me smile. "I already have." He frowned slightly. For the first time, I realized he truly believed I was still the same woman who had begged him to save our marriage. He had no idea she no longer existed. The judge entered exactly at 9. Everyone stood. The hearing began with routine procedural matters, financial disclosures, property valuations, asset division. Daniel's attorney spoke first. "My client has fully complied with every financial request made by this court." Karen didn't interrupt. She simply waited. Patience had become our greatest advantage. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the judge looked toward our table. "Mrs. Mitchell, does your counsel wish to present anything further?" Karen stood. "Yes, Your Honor." She looked at me. I nodded. Without saying a word, I reached into my purse and placed the sealed envelope on the clerk's desk. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. The judge opened it. He removed the letter. At first, his expression remained completely neutral. He read the first page, then the second. Halfway through the third page, a slow smile appeared. Not amusement, recognition. The expression of someone beginning to understand something important. He leaned back slightly. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. Not loudly, not mockingly, just one short, surprised laugh. "Oh," he murmured. "This is interesting." Daniel's smile disappeared. Vanessa stopped moving entirely. Even Daniel's attorney looked confused. The judge continued reading. No one spoke. The silence felt endless. Finally, he lowered the papers. "Mr. Mitchell." Daniel immediately stood. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge tapped the letter gently against the bench. "I have a few questions." Daniel nodded confidently. "Of course." The judge adjusted his glasses. "In your sworn financial disclosure," he paused, "you stated that after February 14th of last year, you no longer had access to account ending in 4829. "That is correct." His answer came almost instantly. The judge looked down again. "Interesting." He lifted another page. "Then perhaps you can explain why. Records show you personally authorized a transfer from that same account." He read the exact date aloud. 3 days later, the courtroom fell completely silent. Daniel blinked. Only once, but I saw it. For the first time that morning, he didn't have an answer ready. His attorney quickly stood. "Your Honor, there may be an administrative misunderstanding." The judge didn't even look at him. "I'm asking Mr. Mitchell." Daniel cleared his throat. "There must be some error." The judge nodded slowly. "Possibly." Then he picked up another document. "Let's see." Karen quietly slid another folder across the table. Rebecca had organized every transaction in chronological order, every transfer connected to supporting documents, every date matched, every signature verified. The judge reviewed several pages. His expression gradually changed. The slight smile disappeared. Professional curiosity became concern. He looked back at Daniel. "Mr. Mitchell, can you explain Stonebridge Consulting?" Daniel hesitated. "It provided consulting services." "What services?" Daniel paused. "Business consulting." The judge waited. "For what business?" Silence. No answer. The judge made a note. He turned another page. "What about Apex Development Solutions?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Another consulting company." The judge nodded. "Interesting." He looked directly at Karen. "Do we have supporting documentation?" "We do, Your Honor." Karen handed over another folder. Inside were corporate registrations, bank records, payment histories, tax filings, everything Rebecca had uncovered. Several minutes passed while the judge quietly reviewed the documents. Finally, he asked, "Mrs. Mitchell, how long did this investigation take?" I answered honestly. "Almost 4 months." He nodded. "I can tell." Then he looked back at Daniel. "Mr. Mitchell," his voice remained calm, "but your explanations are becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile with these records." Daniel's attorney objected again. The judge overruled him almost immediately. Then Karen spoke. "Your Honor, there is one more matter." She placed another folder onto the bench. "This concerns several wire transfers connected to Ms. Vanessa Brooks." Every head in the courtroom turned toward Vanessa. Her confident smile vanished. She looked at Daniel. Daniel didn't look back. Karen opened the folder. The transfers total more than $140,000. Vanessa's face turned completely pale. The judge slowly removed the first page. What exactly am I looking at? Karen answered quietly. Money transferred from accounts Mr. Mitchell failed to disclose. She paused. Into accounts registered to Ms. Brooks. The courtroom erupted into whispers, and for the first time, Vanessa looked genuinely afraid. The courtroom fell silent. Every eye turned toward Vanessa. Just minutes earlier, she had walked into the courthouse looking like a woman who believed she'd already won. Now she looked as though she wanted to disappear. The judge adjusted his glasses and studied the documents Karen had handed him. One page, then another. He wasn't rushing. Judges rarely do when something important lands on their desk. Finally, he looked up. Ms. Brooks. Vanessa swallowed. Yes, Your Honor. Do you recognize these accounts? She glanced toward Daniel. He stared straight ahead. He didn't even look at her. Her voice cracked. I'd like to speak with my attorney. The judge nodded. You'll certainly have that opportunity. He set the papers aside. But first I'd like an answer. Silence. I don't remember these transactions. Karen calmly stood. Your Honor. She handed another document to the clerk. This is a certified banking record. The judge reviewed it for less than a minute. Then he looked back at Vanessa. It appears the account is registered in your name. Vanessa's face lost every trace of color. Daniel finally stood. Your Honor, my personal relationship has nothing to do with this divorce. The judge looked directly at him. I agree. Daniel seemed relieved. Then the judge continued. But concealed financial transfers absolutely do. The relief disappeared immediately. Daniel's attorney tried again. We object to the implication. The judge raised one hand. Counsel. His voice remained calm. I haven't implied anything. He paused. I'm reading your client's own financial records. No one spoke after that. The next 30 minutes felt endless. Every answer Daniel gave created another question. Every explanation contradicted another document. Every attempt to simplify the situation only revealed another inconsistency. Rebecca had been right. The problem wasn't the size of the transfers. It was the pattern. And now everyone in the courtroom could see it. Finally, the judge closed the last folder. He removed his glasses. Mr. Mitchell. Daniel slowly stood again. I have serious concerns regarding the accuracy of your sworn financial disclosures. Daniel opened his mouth. The judge didn't let him speak. Based on the evidence presented today, he looked toward Karen. This court is ordering an immediate forensic audit of all personal and corporate financial records connected to this case. The courtroom became completely still. Daniel looked as if someone had pulled the floor out from under him. His attorney immediately stood. Your Honor. The judge interrupted him without raising his voice. I'm not finished. He continued reading from his notes. Additionally, I find sufficient cause to refer several financial matters to the appropriate investigative authorities for independent review. I heard someone in the gallery quietly gasp. Vanessa covered her mouth with one hand. Daniel closed his eyes. Just for a second, but it was enough. The hearing ended shortly afterward. No dramatic speeches, no shouting, no handcuffs, just quiet conversations between lawyers while reporters rushed toward the hallway. Karen gathered our files. As we stood to leave, she whispered, We couldn't have asked for a better outcome. I shook my head. It doesn't feel like winning. She looked at me. No. It feels like the truth. Outside the courtroom, reporters surrounded Daniel almost immediately. Mr. Mitchell, do you have a comment? Were assets intentionally concealed? Is your company under investigation? He ignored every question. Vanessa followed behind him, shielding her face from the cameras. Only weeks earlier they had arrived together, smiling. Now they walked several feet apart. Neither looked at the other. Karen and I quietly left through another exit. Halfway across the parking lot, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. Hello? A familiar voice. Richard Collins, Daniel's former accountant. They finally did it. What? The audit. Yes. He laughed softly. I've waited years to hear those words. A week later, the forensic investigators officially began their work. Rebecca called almost every evening with updates. Each one sounded worse than the last. Additional shell companies, undisclosed investment accounts, corporate credit cards used for personal expenses, payments disguised as consulting fees. The investigation kept growing. So did the number of people being questioned. Then, one Friday afternoon, Karen called. Her voice sounded different, almost surprised. "Sarah, what happened?" "Daniel's attorney just withdrew from the case." I blinked. "What?" He filed a motion to step aside. "Why?" Karen sighed. "He didn't say. But lawyers rarely leave cases unless they have a very good reason." The following Monday, another headline appeared. 2 major investors suspended projects with Mitchell. Construction pending financial review. By Wednesday, one of Daniel's largest commercial clients canceled a multi-million-dollar contract. By Friday, 3 senior employees resigned. The company he'd spent 2 decades building was beginning to collapse. Not because of gossip, because trust was disappearing. Nearly 2 months after the hearing, I saw Daniel again. Not in court, not at a lawyer's office, just outside a downtown office building. He looked older, not physically, emotionally. The confidence that had once filled every room he entered had vanished. He noticed me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked quietly, "Are you happy now?" I thought about the question, about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the lies, the investigation, the courtroom, the endless nights spent staring at financial statements. Then I answered honestly, "I'm finally at peace." He lowered his eyes. For the first time in 20 years, he had nothing left to say. For months, people kept asking me the same question. "Were you satisfied?" They assumed the investigation, the court hearings, and the financial consequences had given me some sense of revenge. They were wrong. Revenge had stopped mattering a long time ago. By the time the final court orders were signed, I wasn't trying to beat Daniel anymore. I was trying to rebuild Sarah. And those are 2 very different goals. The forensic audit lasted nearly 6 months. Every few weeks, Karen would call with another update. Another hidden account, another missing transfer, another document Daniel hadn't disclosed. The investigators eventually uncovered millions of dollars that had never appeared in his divorce filings. Some of it had been routed through shell companies, some through fake consulting agreements. Some had simply disappeared into accounts connected to people Daniel trusted, including Vanessa. By then, however, Vanessa was no longer standing beside him. She had hired her own attorney. According to Karen, she was now telling investigators she hadn't understood where the money came from. Whether that was true or not wasn't my decision to make. It wasn't my problem anymore. Daniel's business never recovered. Several contracts were canceled. Banks froze new lines of credit. Longtime partners quietly walked away. Employees began leaving one after another. The company that had once been worth millions slowly started falling apart, not because of one mistake, because trust had disappeared. And once people stop trusting you, everything else follows. About 3 months after the hearing, Karen invited me to lunch. She placed a folder on the table. "It's over." I looked at her. "Completely?" She nodded. "The divorce is finalized." I opened the folder. Inside was the final judgment. The court ruled that Daniel had intentionally failed to disclose significant marital assets. The hidden funds were included in the division. Several additional matters had already been referred to the proper authorities. Financially, I would be secure. Ironically, far more secure than Daniel had wanted me to be. I smiled. Not because of the money. Because the truth had finally been written into an official record. Nobody could rewrite history anymore. When I returned home that afternoon, I did something I had been avoiding for months. I opened an old photo album. There we were, 2 23-year-olds standing beside a borrowed pickup truck, laughing, holding each other, completely convinced we would grow old together. For a moment, I allowed myself to miss those people, not because I wanted him back, because I realized they had actually existed once. Daniel hadn't always been the man I divorced. Success, greed, pride. Somewhere along the way, they had changed him into someone neither of us recognized anymore. I quietly closed the album. Some memories deserve respect, even when the ending isn't what you hoped. A few weeks later, I received one final message. It came from Daniel. Just one sentence. "I never thought you'd fight back." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I deleted it, without replying. There was nothing left to say. Life slowly became ordinary again. I continued working as a nurse. The hospital remained the one place where people cared more about compassion than appearances. I rented a smaller home. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't perfect. but every single thing inside it belonged to me. The furniture, the photographs, the quiet. For the first time in years, peace filled the rooms. One Saturday morning, I was sitting outside my favorite coffee shop when a young woman recognized me. She introduced herself shyly. "I heard about your case." I smiled politely. She hesitated before asking, "How did you stay so calm?" I thought about that question for several seconds. Then I answered honestly. I wasn't calm. I was terrified. I just decided fear wasn't allowed to make my decisions anymore. She nodded slowly. I needed to hear that. She thanked me and walked away. I never saw her again, but I hope she's doing well. Looking back now, the courtroom wasn't where I won. The investigation wasn't where I won. Even the final judgment wasn't where I won. I won months earlier, the day I stopped begging someone else to value me. That was the real victory. Everything after that was simply paperwork. If someone had told me at 23 that my marriage would end this way, I would have cried. If someone had told me at 42 that losing that marriage would become the beginning of the happiest chapter of my life, I never would have believed them. Yet here I am, not broken, not bitter, simply free. Sometimes people think justice is watching someone else lose. I've learned something different. Justice is waking up one morning, realizing you no longer carry the weight someone else spent years placing on your shoulders. And that feeling is priceless. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever discovered that someone underestimated you and ended up regretting it? Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. If you enjoy real-life stories about resilience, betrayal, and unexpected justice, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care of yourself and remember, the truth has a way of finding the light.